Good afternoon, everyone. It is 2 o'clock on the dot Eastern Time. This is the Recycling Partnerships Industry Update on COVID-19. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Trisha. I will be facilitating the back end of this webinar for you today. And for those of you that were on our very first COVID industry update back on March 31st, man, what a lifetime has passed since then. Am I right? Dylan, do you feel the same way?
Yes, time is moving very fast and very slowly at the same time. It's the space-time continuum is upended.
Cody, I feel like we've aged like 3 years since we did that webinar together a few months ago.
Yeah, there's been a lot of changes since, and I'm looking forward to digging into it.
Me too. We know that you have a plethora of options when looking for COVID resources these days, and we are so grateful that you are giving us your time and the ability to share our resources with you. So with that, let's get into a couple of housekeeping items for today. PSA, we are recording this webinar. If that's something that your organization or your company isn't cool with, then I'm going to have to ask you to kindly hop off the webinar and make sure to check out the recording, which will be available on our COVID webpage later this week. The slides will also be available with the recording, as well as a quick recap, just like we've done in the past with some talking points available for you. We will be using the question and answer feature for today's webinar instead of our chat function. So we don't want that button. We do want this button right here, Q&A. What the Q&A feature allows us to do is to take a quick poll of how many people and how many of you have the same question so that we can prioritize the information that you're looking for the most during this next hour. Type your question in the Q&A box, click send, and you're welcome to send your question anonymously if you so choose. We'll reply by either typing in the Q&A window or answering the question out loud. That's always our preferred method of speaking with you. First up, Cody, I'll pass it your way.
Thanks, Trish. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Well, great. Hello, and thank you for being here. We have a great group of folks to talk with today with some important updates on COVID-related impacts to the recycling system. Like Trish said, I'm Cody Marshall, and a little later on, I'm going to talk with Colin, a senior reporter from Resource Recycling, about some kind of what the reprocessors and the end markets look like. Before I do that, I'd like to recognize and thank the people in our industry that are still collecting and processing material we're generating at our homes. They're drivers, supervisors, MRF operators, going to work every day, ensuring supply gets to the products we use every day. It's a tough job, no matter the condition, but the past few months have shown us it's even tougher now, so we really appreciate that work, so thank you. I'm just going to give a quick update. We keep track of what's going on with collection programs and MRF programs. There are other sources to get regular updates. Cole with Waste Dive does a great job of this, so if you want regular updates, check in with Waste Dive to get these updates. This is a moving target, so we're pretty close, but we sometimes miss, it changes every day. We sometimes miss updates, but I just want to kind of give you a general sense of what it looks like out there as we're trying to monitor the current landscape. So what we're looking at now is about 79 programs, curbside programs that are currently suspended because of COVID. But we have seen a leveling off of suspensions, and we're seeing programs resume. So to date, about 40 programs have resumed after being suspended. We're also looking at MRFs. There are still about 4 MRFs in the country that are temporarily suspended, with 16 MRFs coming back online. We think that after they put in some safety precautions and social distancing, kind of new policies that allow these MRFs to go back up and running. We're also monitoring the future of recycling as things kind of get back to normal. If you could go to the next slide, Trish. There are important things to note. While the majority of city and county collection programs continue to operate, program budgets are under stress. So what I just showed you is about 1% of the collection programs that exist, and about 1% of the MRFs that operate in this country are temporarily suspended. But most importantly, something we have to monitor, keep an eye on, is the budget constraints these programs are going to come under. These cities often pay with their recycling through general funds. They rely on tourism dollars and sales tax. And so with these issues of people not traveling, we're seeing less money coming into the cities. It's pretty straightforward. And what we want to do is be able to kind of keep an eye on this and kind of see where issues might arise to help these programs as they're making very difficult decisions to kind of stay up and running. We're very pleased to see that the majority of programs are keeping recycling as an essential service. It is a time for collection programs. We're having a lot of discussions with cities and counties and haulers around the country. It's a time where they're looking at making their programs more efficient and automated. This is really important, and Dylan and his panel might get into that. And so I'm really pleasantly I'm grateful to see kind of the recycling being looked at as a part of the system and not looked at in a vacuum, where they're looking at the garbage collection and yard waste and bulky and recycling all kind of related, and how they all need to be more efficient, and not just saying recycling, kind of pushing it off to the side. It's a whole system for these cities and counties. This highlights the need for state grant dollars being more important now than ever. I wanted to flag that. State dollars are definitely stressed as well, and grant dollars are so important for a lot of local governments, for equipment grants and education. So as states move forward with their budgeting process, let's keep this in mind and make sure our leaders in each of our states understand the importance of these grant dollars. We're certainly going to keep an eye on that. And then another thing that might be coming up later in this webinar is MRF automation has become more important now than ever with these social distancing issues that have arose. It's really catalyzed this trend of automating MRFs, and so we're kind of keeping an eye on how that might affect the program. So now I'm going to get Colin involved here. And Colin, if you don't mind, Dylan will be talking with Eureka and Swana about the view from the MRF and the hauler. But let's take it the next step into the supply chain. So let's look at the reprocessors, the mills, the reclaimers. How is that part of the supply chain managing through this time? If you don't mind kind of touching on that and showing us what markets look like at this time.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Cody. And it's good to be back talking with you all. I agree, things have changed quite a bit since the last time we had a webinar. Yeah, so I can offer some perspective from the reprocessors. I guess in some sense, just to start with, they are feeling, the same impacts that businesses around the country are seeing. I think the most immediate impact, similar to the MRF setting, was on modifying their operating protocols to allow for new social distancing measures, as well as adding, cleaning regimen to make sure everything was getting decontaminated and prevent any possible spread within their facilities. Schedule changes, things like that. I talked to a few plastics reclaimers who quickly moved to have all administrative staff working from home, only have the vital plant operations staff working on site. So these things, these are a shift for these companies, but one reclaimer actually told me it was pretty amazing how seamless the transition was. They were able to have even have an office assistant working from home, yet still be able to manage the shipping and receiving operations. She was working the software and cameras that allowed the assistant to weigh trucks remotely and print tickets and bills of lading, that kind of thing. So it's an adjustment, but it's one that many companies were able to make pretty quickly. And it was a similar story at paper mills. They definitely enacted new safety measures to accommodate social distancing. But in some sense, kind of like you mentioned, I'm not going to say it was easy for these facilities, but in some sense, reclaimers and paper mills are set up fairly well to do this because they have such a large amount of automation involved already. It's still a new thing to get used to, but it's feasible for these operations and they can stay in business, unlike some industries that simply had to shut down. I think a more significant early impact for the reprocessors was this question of essential. What's an essential industry? I mentioned on the last webinar that collection and MRFs were pretty quickly deemed essential in one way or another in most states. Often it got lumped in with solid waste collection. On the reprocessing side, it wasn't quite as clear. Many of the executive orders didn't have specific language noting that, plastics processors or recycled paper mills, for example, are essential or non-essential. So it led to companies having to interpret the orders, sometimes with lawyers and that kind of process. So that was interesting. One processor I talked to had determined their company was essential based on their customers. So the state order said that suppliers to the food service industry were considered essential, and this company provided plastic products for that industry. So because of that, they were able to stay in business, and they interpreted themselves to be essential. Paper mills were more clearly defined in these orders, I think, particularly because of the high profile demand increase we've seen for some paper products like toilet paper, for example. So the orders were pretty straightforward about deeming suppliers in the paper industry as essential operations. All told, I don't know of any state orders shutting down plastics recycling plants or paper mills. There was one state order that determined glass processors were non-essential. For some reason, they singled them out, but that was quickly reversed, and they were able to stay open. And then another impact for reprocessors was simply, the economic reality of COVID-19. We can talk about this a little bit more later, but one reclaimer told me that on the demand side, the demand for their product decreased by 20% within the first week or so of the onset of kind of the stay-at-home orders and when the pandemic hit in the US. And so mixed with, taking all those things together, limiting schedules, shifting operations within facilities, all while dealing with just the uncertainty of where this leads, that's been a hardship for these businesses. Reclaimers that rely on bottle deposit material, they're looking at feedstock shortages. That makes it hard to keep the facility running normally. So yeah, those things were challenges, and the Paycheck Protection Program was definitely a big help for companies that were able to get through that kind of onerous process. That gives them 8 weeks of payroll, helps them stay in business. It was depleted pretty quickly, the funding, but they reauthorized it. So that's been a good thing for these companies. And I think, as for where they're going from here, I think it was summed up. There was a recent statement from International Paper, which is a major operator of recycled paper mills in the US. And they basically said they're looking at the pandemic in 4 phases. The first being containment, which, we've all been going through for the past few months, and in some sense we're still going through. The second being recovery, where we start to come out of containment. And there's more risk during this phase, but we just kind of have to see how it goes. Then there will be essentially a normalization phase where we get into the new normal of how this looks and figure out how to go forward. And then back into like a growth phase where you can sort of start to think about business growth again and kind of the general business operations. So I think that's a pretty good illustration of how some of the reprocessors are thinking about coming out of this pandemic.
And kind of speaking about paper here, you touched on it a few times, and I really appreciate your perspective. I think you're talking to a lot of folks around the country and globally about this and supply. So really like to hear your perspective. So much appreciated. And I'm hearing a lot about OCC and mixed paper prices. What are you hearing from mills about supply? If you could dig a little bit deeper into that.
Yeah, definitely. And if you want to go to the next, there's the price chart, and that kind of tells the story on its own right there. But we've definitely seen some significant shifts in commodity pricing since this began, notably the fiber market. OCC was, last year it was $30 a ton for many months, and now it's increased. Earlier this month it hit over $100 a ton, most of that since March alone. And that basically just comes from the supply and demand dynamic. There's a huge source of commercial OCC is the cleanest and a big source of that for paper mills and retail stores, receiving large shipments, food service businesses, those sorts of operations. Those are essentially shut down after mid-March, so that supply just evaporated. There was some increase in grocery stores and with people stocking up on material, so they were seeing higher shipments, but not enough to offset the other losses. And although e-commerce is up with more people ordering at home, the quality, I'm sure everyone on this call knows, the quality is lower in the residential stream, but the recovery rate's also lower. So you're not getting quite as much OCC into the system. There was recently an analyst has estimated that recovered paper collection across the country is down by as much as 30 to 50% in the second half of March and all of April. So supply has been hit, and at the same time, the demand has increased substantially, especially for corrugated packaging. With as I said, e-commerce is really on the rise right now, even more than usual. So OCC is in high demand, and mills are having trouble sourcing it, and that's driving the price up pretty wildly. One major mill operator, kind of how they're reacting, one of them that also runs recycling collection service, recently said that it's begun keeping more of its OCC in the US rather than exporting it to buyers abroad. So they're, having to kind of shift how they do business in the interest of having enough material to feed its own mills. I'm also hearing a familiar story. I'm hearing about mills, looking at the high price of OCC and the difficulty of getting it, and they're looking into using more mixed paper because of those supply challenges. That same thing, I remember that when China exited the mixed paper market, and mixed paper was suddenly at $0 a ton. Looks like a more attractive feedstock, so we're seeing some of that. And paper mills, I mean, they're really anticipating it's going to take a while to get the supply back to where it was. They're budgeting in higher costs, in their future forecasts as a result. So I guess, what does that mean for recycling program operators? I don't want to focus all on price. I show this chart just because it shows kind of the really interesting shift and the skyrocketing prices we've seen. But, prices go up and down, OCC prices. I'm even hearing now that in the last week or so that they're declining a bit. So it's not all about price, but I think the key point here is, in my assessment, that there's strong demand for some of these kind of major recovered materials, OCC, other grades of fiber. The pandemic is showing just how strong that demand is. And I think that's an important message for recycling programs who are struggling or concerned about the viability of recycling in the future. Without this supply of OCC, manufacturers are facing pretty significant business impacts. In one of the earnings calls recently, a mill operator said they're anticipating paying $55 million more in feedstock input costs for the coming quarter, just because of the recovered paper market shift in large part. So I guess there's a home for these materials, is my point. And I think that's important to remember.
Yeah, definitely. I think when you sometimes hear leaders in our cities that are dealing with a lot of priorities, it's just like, well, is it even working nationally? I hear things, it's not important, it's not essential. I think this shows that it's essential, that the markets want this material. So I'm really glad you flagged that. You had an interesting story when we connected earlier about end markets kind of shifting. Can you dig in just a little bit? We just have a couple minutes left. Like, how has demand shifted in market operations?
Sure, yeah. This has been an interesting impact from the virus. And I think one of the illustrative examples sort of how demand has shifted comes in the plastics space. We had talked to KW Plastics, which is a huge plastics processor located in Alabama, and they saw an interesting change in where its material was being sold. They sell a lot into a lot of end markets, including a big component is the automotive sector, but automotive manufacturing is basically suspended and has been since the stay-at-home orders began. It ground to a halt, and that demand for recycled plastic in that space dropped, accordingly. I think the plants are starting to reopen now in the past week or so, but the suspension went on for a long time. And so KW saw its demand decline in that space, but at the same time, as consumer spending shifted and people were stocking up on materials, the company saw its demand increase in markets for personal care products, household cleaning agents, detergents, soaps, those types of products. And so that was a pretty significant increase for their HDPE sales. I think overall it wasn't enough to offset the other decreases, if I recall correctly. But it's interesting to see how that general kind of wider economic trends we see across the country play into recycled material demand. And then on the paper space, there was also some interesting examples. I mentioned there's strong OCC demand for packaging to keep up with the increase in e-commerce, and some increase in mixed paper and other grades that go into tissue production. But at the same time, there have been pretty substantial declines in office paper demand. you know, as we don't have any schools or offices really operating regularly right now, companies are having to adjust, you know, what they're producing. There was a big mill operator idled an entire Alabama paper mill that uses recycled content to make printing and writing paper grades. So there's just, you know, there's no buyers, and so they have to reduce production. I think these are probably temporary impacts. Schools and offices are seemingly going to come back at some point under the new normal, and the automotive sector is starting to open back up. But it's a good illustration of what the pandemic has done to recovered material markets and how recycled material is connected to the wider economy.
And I think it's just so important we continue to have these dialogues publicly as people are trying to grapple with what the new landscape might look like, what the gaps might be, and really fascinating how KW was able to pivot. And I think many of us are going to have to pivot and support each other in different sectors of the industry. So that's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. We do need to move on with Dylan and his panel. So thank you, Colin. I think we might hear from you a little bit later on about some webinars happening in the future. So thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Cody.
Dylan, I'm going to pass it to you and your panel.
Thank you so much, Cody, and thank you, Colin, for joining us. Now, for this part of the conversation, we're going to be talking to a couple of industry leaders. I'm very pleased to welcome two friends and colleagues of mine, David Biderman, Executive Director and CEO of the Solid Waste Association of North America, otherwise known as Swana, and Kate Davenport, co-president of Eureka Recycling, a nonprofit MRF that is based in the Minneapolis area, the Twin Cities area. And I'm actually going to have them introduce their own organizations, and then we'll start digging in a little bit about those other two key pieces of the supply chain, the MRF and the hauler. David, welcome. You want to introduce a little bit of background on Swana?
Sure, Dylan. Thank you very much. And thank you to Cody and Colin for that great first panel discussion. That was very informative. First and foremost, I want to say hello to everybody, and I hope everybody is staying safe and healthy during the pandemic, and know that things will get better. So a little background on Swana, Solid Waste Association of North America. We're the largest association in both the United States and Canada, with close to 11,000 members in both countries, about 10,000 in the United States and about 1,000 in Canada. We've got chapters from coast to coast in the United States and have chapters in the Caribbean and the Pacific Basin, so Guam and Samoa and things, and Hawaii. And so that gives us a really broad perspective on what's happening, not just in the recycling side of the industry, but the broader solid waste industry. The other thing that I think is very relevant is, because our members are individuals in both the public and private sectors, we hear from all aspects of the industry about everything. And that really gives us the opportunity to sift information and be hopefully able to provide guidance to our members and others about how to respond to this uncharted territory, uncharted waters that we're in. Our mission statement is our vision says that we're supposed to be transforming waste into a resource, and neither national sword nor COVID-19 is going to inhibit us from doing that. It just makes it a little more challenging. And the core programs of Swana are focused on education, research, and advocacy. That's what it said in our strategic plan 5 years ago. And then 5 years ago, I joined Swana, and I just wrote the word safety in. And since that time, we've been focusing a lot on safety, which is going to be part of what I discuss later. And also, I think, allows us to have some insight into the type of safety measures that need to be taken by frontline workers to address and respond to the COVID situation. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. Thank you, Dylan.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome, David. And then we're going to go down the supply chain a little bit to the folks that are taking all the stuff that's picked up and sorted it all out. And Kate, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And why don't you let our viewers and listeners know a little bit about Eureka Recycling? And I think you're still on mute.
I thought you all unmuted. Now I'm here.
There you go.
So thanks for having me today. I'm excited to be in the conversation. Just a little bit about Eureka. We're a not-for-profit social enterprise zero waste organization based in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. We operate a collections fleet as well as a MRF. We have the municipal contracts for the city of Minneapolis and St. Paul, as well as several surrounding suburbs. And then we also receive material from other haulers in the marketplace. Before COVID, we were about 75% residential, 25% commercial. We're now about 90% residential and 10% commercial. And we can talk about that shift a little bit, but that's been a change since March. We do about 100,000 tons per year in our MRF. We're known because of our mission and our approach to things for being kind of a best-in-class facility. We have probably one of the lowest residual rates in MRFs across the country. We have about 35 fleet trucks in our fleet, and we do about $15 million a year is our operating budget. We have about a little over 115 employees. And one thing I think, and Dylan, you can go to the next slide. So our mission is to demonstrate that waste is preventable, not inevitable. And we really believe that we can get to zero waste, that we have designed waste into the system, we can design waste out of the system as a society. And so we approach our mission looking at three kind of core areas, which is where do waste issues intersect with having a stable climate, with healthy communities and strong local economies. And so that what we call triple bottom line approach is integrated into day-to-day decision-making as well as long-term strategic planning. And so where you see that show up is things like all of our staff are full-time Eureka employees with paid benefits and paid time off. That's part of having a healthy community. That's part of having a strong local economy. We have had a real focus on material quality and have been known for that for a very long time. That's coming from the perspective of the reason we recycle at the end of the day is to reduce natural resource extraction and benefit our climate and have healthy communities. So about 85% of our material stays in the state of Minnesota, about 95% in the Midwest and 100% in North America. And that's a result of really wanting to focus on strong local economies. So I would just end by saying, I think that triple bottom line approach to how we approach our operations has really been beneficial to us through some of the ups and downs, particularly over the last few years. That focus on material quality, that focus on full-time staff means we have a very safety conscious staff who are well trained. So some of the transitions that have had to happen in the last 3 months were challenging, but really we had this embedded culture that made that easier. Dylan, you can go to the next slide. So that's just our, again, we really believe in zero waste and that's the way that we approach how we do recycling. We think that it's not just about can we recycle or what are we recycling, but how are we recycling and why are we recycling? And that approach, I think, makes us unique in some ways in the recycling space.
Great, thank you so much, Kate. That's terrific. So, as we get into the questions, what is recycling is a question that I ask often when I'm talking about this business that we all know and love, and the answer is, of course, that it's feedstock. Recycling is feedstock, manufacturing feedstock as part of a robust supply chain driving the circular economy. And, that recycling that we're talking about has to get picked up and sorted out by people. And, as David said, even without a global pandemic, there's a great deal of work and processes that are in place to help keep the men and women that do that work safe. So I wanted to kind of start at the MRF and start with you, Kate, to just talk about what you're seeing at your facility, with regards to health and safety of your workers. Obviously, you have processes in place. What are some of those processes and how have those changed in this era of COVID-19?
Yeah, so by about mid-March, as we started to see and realize the severity of COVID, we upgraded and updated a lot of our procedures. We're doing things like many facilities are doing, which is we're social distancing. All staff are wearing masks. We went through our facility and created space between sort positions to create that 6 feet of distance. For example, things are being cleaned more often. Everything from doorknobs to bathroom doors to the touch screen that our managers, the handheld device that our managers use in the MRF to control the equipment. We're taking temperatures in the morning to try to track staff's safety and health. There were a lot of questions there about whether that was HIPAA compliant, and lots of kind of legal conversations. So there's a lot of things that we've done. I think, you know, when you talk to our staff, it was a culture shift too. We, I think by the nature of how we operate, really have a family feel. Our MRF staff do potluck every day for lunch and share meals, and all of a sudden that had to stop and everybody was eating 6 feet apart with plexiglass. We staggered shifts. So instead of having one lunch break with everybody, we're slowing the system down over about a 2-hour period to stagger lunch shifts so people can eat 6 feet apart. So I think because of our culture of safety that we already had, the transition, we had a real team approach to it. But I will also say that there is a shift, where there's a loss of that sense of community. So a lot of our work now is trying to figure out how do we recreate that in a different context.
Yeah, that's a trip. That's, you know, I'm so used to being able to smile at somebody at the store, and of course they can't see through my mask to see that smile. So that's a really, really great point, Kate. So David, you know, bringing you into the conversation, you know, you are widely known throughout the industry as a leader in helping keep workers safe. You know, so I would really love to have you dig in a little bit on what the view is from where you sit at Swana.
Sure. Thank you, Dylan. And so I'm going to focus more on the collection side, since I think Kate has covered the recycling side pretty well. Collection employees, you know, face a wide variety of hazards just, you know, by virtue of the fact that they're collecting waste and recycling every day. And then you layer onto that the possibility that they're collecting material from a home where somebody is sick with COVID. And that obviously creates a lot of concerns in the workforce. We're not, you know, doctors or epidemiologists at Swana, but we're good at reading the material from the federal leaders and state agencies who are giving advice and turning that into guidance for the industry. And the truth is that solid waste and recyclables themselves aren't particularly effective vectors for transmitting the disease, but we certainly understand that workers are concerned about picking up material from a home that someone might have COVID in. And there's no sign on the home that says, yes, I have COVID, handle with care. So that perception of risk occurs in all 140 million stops that residential collectors have at a minimum. And so the obvious point, of course, is that all collection workers should be protected by wearing appropriate PPE. And then the question is, well, what do you mean by appropriate PPE? Well, everybody should wear gloves. Well, people were wearing gloves doing collection well before COVID. There's always been infectious substances in the waste stream, pathogens, there's been needles. People unfortunately will get stuck once in a while by a needle at a MRF. And hepatitis B is often the thing that we test about. There's been less certainty about whether or not facial coverings are required. And we've had some states and local governments requiring facial coverings for essential workers. And of course, the waste collection and recycling collection industry has been designated as essential by both the federal government and every state government that's issued an emergency order. And then there are other states where they're recommending facial coverings, but not requiring them. And then of course, there are states that have not stated anything about facial covering. So you have a bit of a patchwork, but the prevailing wisdom is that it's better for you to be wearing a facial covering if you're going to be touching the material. And in the recycling side of the industry in particular, where some of the material isn't placed in a container, but is left next to the container, and as was discussed on in the earlier panel, we've seen an excessive amount of cardboard being generated on the residential side as people were buying e-commerce and getting ready for staying at home. We have seen a substantial increase in the volume of material being generated on the residential side. So, on the residential side, anywhere from 5 to 30% increase. And, whether it's boxes next to the container, whether it's overflowing containers, there's a lot more material to be picked up on the residential side, which contributed to the 100 or so curbside programs that were temporarily suspended because the local governments and their haulers needed to make sure all the garbage got picked up. On the flip side of that, we've seen a decline in commercial volume as businesses have shut down in many places. In New York City, for example, commercial waste volume is down by more than 50%. And as you might imagine, that means a lot less recyclables are there as well. And so, you know, what we're trying to do is message to people about how to provide for their workers from an employer to the employee perspective. And then perhaps we can talk a little bit about public-facing messaging to make sure that the public does their part to protect the frontline workers.
Excellent point. And I love to pull Kate in. Kate, you know, what are you seeing about like the changes of what's coming into your MRF? Because obviously, you know, we're not all in offices. Not all of us work, you know, are used to working from home like people at the Recycling Partnership are. You know, new people are kind of pulling in. What are you seeing in terms of the stuff coming into your system?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, we've seen a big change in commercial, significant drop. It's now down to about 10% of our material, where it was about 25%. Our cities that we receive material from are all a little bit different, but on average, we're seeing about a 15% increase on the residential side. Some are a little bit more, some are a little bit less. We have seen about 20% increase in aluminum, for example.
Wow.
So that's all of us drinking our LaCroix.
Mental health is important. Yeah,
here at home. That we were actually pretty shocked at that significant increase. We've seen an increase in glass too. Yeah. And I think one of the challenges there is that, you know, a MRF is designed for a certain composition of material, and to have the composition change that quickly it is challenging to figure out how are we running material, where are we getting bottlenecks, do we need to move staff around, how do we do that and keeping safe distance. The other thing I want to know, and I see this as one of the questions that came up, is that, and David noted on this too, you know, our staff have been wearing gloves in the facility forever because it's by its nature a dangerous job. We wore N95 masks in certain parts of the facility where air wasn't filtered before this. What is challenging is that you know, we have a stockpile of N95 masks, but that's where are we going to get those as that stockpile goes down. So I think, and we've seen the same thing with gloves, right? There's a shortage of gloves. We haven't heard about that as much in the news, but I think that's a coming challenge, is how does the recycling industry get access to some of that PPE? We're not first in line and not, you know, as compared to health workers, but how do we get access to that, I think is going to be a coming challenge.
That's a great question. David, have you seen similar challenges at your point? Because obviously masks are, I'm sure, de rigueur at this point for your frontline workers. You know, that last slide you had you had even the you know, the full face mask. You know, are you hearing from your members that shortages or that coming shortages is a concern?
So there's really two parts to answering that question. In late March into early April, there were some both private companies and small communities, municipal sanitation departments, that were having difficulty accessing either PPE or actually wipes. There was a shortage of that material as we all went into lockdown in late March. Since that time, I think those bottlenecks in the supply chain have loosened up, and I'm not aware of there being a concern at the moment. And the key phrase is there is at the moment, yeah, of people having appropriate facial coverings or gloves. My concern, however, is that as Americans go back to work, the new normal is going to involve people wearing gloves when they commute to work. It may involve wearing gloves in the office. And I'm participating in a FEMA group that has weekly calls discussing the supply chain. And we have mentioned our concern about our industry being able to access vital PPE to allow us to continue to perform the job of collecting waste as the waste starts to shift back to the new normal. We're not going to stay at 15% more residential waste coming into the Eureka Recycling facility and less commercial waste. We're shifting away from what was peak residential. But I continue to communicate with FEMA and other federal decision makers to make sure that our industry is not first in line, because I think there are others who should be first in line, but we're very close to the front of the line.
Yeah. That's and obviously that impact is going to be felt. You're obviously talking about the public sector, but also private sector. Whether you're a MRF or whether you're a private sector hauler as well. Really kind of digging in on that. I think it's going to be really important that we all stay connected. And again, I want to kind of go back to the feedstock a little bit. I keep thinking about. People are asking me about, as I'm sure they're asking you guys about too, is about all this cardboard. Is that cardboard kind of moving out of that commercial sector and into that residential sector, which is a long-term trends that we already were seeing, and then seeing the prices really spike because obviously that material is really, really needed as they need more of those boxes kind of getting into the circular economy. It's like, what, 60 days from door to door to get it back on your door, delivered if you're ordering some toilet paper online. What are you guys seeing in terms from where you sit in terms of markets and how they're impacting your parts of the supply chain? OCC is up, but not everything's up, obviously. What are some of the challenges or the good things that you're seeing in that area?
Sure, I can jump in there. I mean, listening to Colin before us, the trends that he's noting is very much what we've experienced. I mean, we're getting over $130 a ton for cardboard. I mean, if you had asked me 3 months ago if that was going to be the case, I would have not believed you. So we've seen a drastic change in fiber pricing. We've seen a drastic drop in plastics pricing. PET, HDP color is, I've never seen it that low. We, as I mentioned before, have our material stays domestic. And so even with that, we had some buffer against the impacts of National Sword in terms of movement, but the pricing drop in plastic is pretty significant. We also saw some challenges in moving some of our plastic, particularly our PET. That we experienced that in April. We've started to see movement again, but that's something we're watching closely because, as many of you know, it's about price, but it's also about movement. No MRF has the ability to warehouse for weeks on end, and so that's a concern as well. And I think an underlying piece to that is what we saw in April and May was a lack of demand for example, PET in our Midwest markets. We saw a huge demand out in California, particularly for a range of reasons, but the transport cost was significant. So I think it'll be interesting to see how the supply chains change and how we address the transport cost issue in regards to plastic, where we see pockets of real demand.
That's really interesting. David, have you heard from your members, impacts on that, or is that sort of, are you looking more at the operational flow?
So we're hearing that less material is being shipped abroad, that because of the higher prices that are being paid, particularly for fiber products, that even less fiber is being exported than was being exported, say, in January or February, because there's demand here in the United States for that material. I think the dramatic price increase we've seen is a testament to the fact that the supply chains really got scrambled, and it's going to take a while to unscramble them. And it would not surprise me if, as we reopen, we're going to see pricing normalize somewhere. I don't think OCC prices stay north of stay at $130 a ton forever. But Kate, as long as you're getting it, obviously take it.
I will.
But what I also think is that some of what we have been talking about, that recycling in the United States isn't dead, and we're in a post-National Sword environment where there's going to be greater domestic demand, which means greater support for the material and greater support for municipal recycling programs. I think that's very real. And the fact that so many people are home provides such an opportunity to educate people about recycling right, because all of a sudden they're generating a lot more material than they used to generate, and they're at home when the garbage truck goes by or the recycling truck goes by. So we have this unique opportunity to educate people again about what recycling right means.
Exactly. And, I think that's a really great point, is educating folks that, being intentional. I think there's a comment in the Q&A of really talking about, what their habits are, and that, when they have that bottle in hand, that box in hand, that can in hand, that that material needs to flow through the system, that it needs to be back in there. I agree. I think this is a great opportunity to communicate to residents, a talking point for our participants. Kate, I interrupted you. You were going to say something.
Oh, no. I just wanted to add to it. I'm watching some of the chat questions that are coming through. I think it really is important to note that plastic pricing decline is absolutely connected to the decrease in oil and natural gas prices. And I think that's a really important thing for people to understand, that it's always been the case that recycled plastic pricing is tied to oil and natural gas. And that is, from our perspective, the main driver here. And I think this coincides with a lot of movement that was happening in the industry beforehand, which was brands making recycled content commitments. There has been talk about recycled content mandates on a policy level, and I think we really need to continue to look at that as an industry, to continue to have the volatility in plastic pricing based on oil and natural gas is a challenge, and it's not going to help us meet the environmental goals that we're trying to meet. I think it's also interesting to note that although we've seen an increase in aluminum, our pricing for aluminum is at an all-time low, which is in part due to, and we're seeing that on steel cans as too, and that's in part related to the demand from the auto industry is down. So it'll be interesting to see that. But I just wanted to make a note.
Oh, absolutely. And in addition to that, the low oil prices, which obviously, oil and natural gas, a lot of plastics are made from natural gas, and the challenges there, that in addition to that, it's also, a lot of these companies are looking towards what is likely going to be a decreased demand for consumer products at a certain point, right? So, we know that there is, as the millions of workers around the country are being laid off, there's going to be less money kind of buying that stuff. And so that definitely also has that impact as well. So, I imagine that's going to, and that's why I think that those considerations of those brands that are really saying, hey, we want to use this material back in our products, whether it's through, a recycled content goal, or, like through the Association of Plastic Recyclers Recycling Demand Champions program, which is voluntary consumption of polyolefins, which is really impacted by this stuff. I think is really important that we need to grow those types of agreements and those types of programs to make sure to get more of that material into the circular economy. That's really great points, Kate. So David, I wanted to you can either hop in there and have some questions as well. But I also just wanted to kind of see, like, recycling is an essential service. They're essential workers. But, I think one thing that we want to really communicate loud and clear is that recycling is going to be essential as we are going to have some budget challenges coming down the line as well. Obviously, I mean, my daughter's schools are furloughed the Fridays for the remote learning for the rest of this school year, which is really pointing to some budget challenges that are going to happen in the Portland, Oregon area, and that's going to happen all over the country. What are you seeing in regards to that, in terms of, keeping that robust support of recycling at the ground level?
Well, I'm very concerned that recycling programs will be under the gun in the upcoming fiscal environment. There are conversations already taking place in some municipalities about modifying or eliminating programs. New York City suspended its curbside organics program for a year for budget reasons. I read earlier today that East Peoria, Illinois is dropping curbside recycling because they don't want to spend $181,000 on curbside recycling. Though they're making tough decisions in a limited tax environment, in a limited revenue environment. And you mentioned that we, need to be thinking about, or someone mentioned at the beginning, about state grant money being important. And I think we need to be thinking bigger than that about federal money. The federal government has done a very good job of giving out money to a lot of different types of people and organizations, whether it was PPP or other things. It's really important for local governments in order to maintain the essential services that they maintain, to continue to receive money from the federal government. That's why we added our name to a letter that was sent in by the National League of Cities, I guess last week. And then separately, but related to that, is the continued push to have some sort of congressional legislation that supports recycling past Congress, whether it's the Recycle Act, the Recover Act, the Save Our Seas 2.0 Act, which we could do a whole separate webinar on. There is bipartisan interest in Congress in supporting recycling, because recycling creates jobs and it's good for the environment. That's a rare win-win that both Democrats and Republicans agree on. And then they differ on the numbers and whatnot, but everybody really kind of agrees on that. And then our progress towards getting one of those pieces of legislation over the finish line in both houses of Congress was derailed by COVID. Save Our Seas 2.0 passed the US Senate unanimously.
Incredible.
And
yeah.
we were gearing up to request that the House leadership take it up. And then COVID hit. And so we have been in conversation with congressional staff over the last month or so about when do we start having those conversations with key congressional representatives about the need to focus on recycling. I don't think it's this summer. I think it's in the fall. And then the fall is an election year. So how much attention are we going to get then? But I think the federal government needs to be looked at as the backstop for municipal recycling programs.
I think that's a really great point, David, and I think you are seeing a hunger from Congress, from both the Senate and the House recycling caucuses, reaching out to groups like Swana, groups like the Recycling Partnership, and even nonprofits like Eureka Recycling, reaching out, trying to get the right information on the ground, to be able to really both inform and help guide what policy decisions they're making. And I agree. I think like the Recover and the Recycle Acts are good examples of gauging policy at that federal level, which is, I just keep thinking about, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, these conversations would be unthinkable, just like the price you're getting, Kate, for OCC, right? It's unthinkable. I think we're really going to see a lot more of this in the coming years.
Yeah, and I just, to add on to that, I think
Please.
we think it's really important in the current moment to look at how to support municipalities. This was noted before, they're going to see sales tax revenue decreases. We're hearing that already from some of our city customers in terms of budget cuts, and they're the ones that are going to have to bear the cost. In large part, and we're going to really have to look at that in an immediate perspective. But we also need to make sure that that we don't stop there. That there really is the need for fundamental reform in the recycling system, and we need to see what role the federal government plays, but also what role do producers and responsibility to producers have in that mix. We would be also in support of looking at the Break Free from Plastics Act as well in that mix on a federal level. And I think on the plastics issue, we need to really make sure that we are looking at the subsidization of oil and natural gas as well as a challenge to making recycling.
Yeah, great points. I was quoted this week in something talking about that the industry at large and all the various stakeholders know that they need to play a greater role, and it's going to take a lot of effort, ingenuity, and cash. And I think that really speaks to that. I think it's important, to make sure that there is capitalization, and organizations like us, like the Recycling Partnership, are infusing, millions and millions of dollars of cash into the system, and we need to do a lot more. So I think that's a really great point. As we're kind of reaching the end, I would really love for the two of you to kind of look into, your crystal ball from where you sit, the DC area and the Twin Cities area, of, what the future looks like. David, do you want to give us a closing comment?
Sure, thanks, Dylan. So I have a line in many of my PowerPoints that we're entering a new normal, and that there's going to be great variety in how different parts of the country enter into the new normal and what that new normal looks like. How Washington, D.C. recovers is going to be different from Washington State, and how Western Massachusetts recovers is going to be different from Boston, Massachusetts. If anyone says they have a working crystal ball, they're trying to sell you something. That being said, we are definitely past peak residential. And that means that we're going to see residential volume on the recycling side start to decrease. It already has. It's going to continue to decrease, and you're going to start to see commercial volume start to increase as stores and industrial facilities start to reopen. I think that's going to happen, but I don't think we get back to pre-COVID levels because the economy is just completely different. We have a 15% unemployment rate. I'm sure it's going to go higher. And so we're not going to have as much economic output. And when people don't have as much money, they buy less stuff, which leads to less waste and less recyclables. One of the challenges we're going to have is how do we reopen? You know, when offices go back to work, some of these issues that Kate was mentioning about social distancing and frequently cleaning things and, you know, making sure people are you know, educated about personal hygiene. Everyone's going to need to be thinking about those things. And one of the things we're doing is trying to start thinking about what type of information people need to be able to resume working again. The other things that are Washington, D.C. focused that I just want to briefly mention, by coincidence, I had 2 conversations with folks at EPA today about the America Recycles Network and about their efforts to follow up on America Recycles Day last November, which has been, I don't want to say derailed, but it has been slightly delayed by COVID.
Sure, of course.
And I was a strong proponent of encouraging them to continue to work fiercely and aggressively. And, you know, they continue to operate under the assumption that in November of this year, the administrator is going to announce a federal recycling goal or a set of federal recycling goals. And that's important because even if Congress does not provide funding to recycling or to cities for that matter, a federal goal is a catalyzing event, the same way that the food waste goal that was established in 2014 was a catalyzing event for people in the food waste supply chain. So I think that's really important and a potentially very positive thing that we're keeping an eye on. The other interesting conversation I had today that relates to this topic is the State Department and EPA convened a conference call for stakeholders around changes to the Basel Convention. The Basel Convention is an international treaty that regulates the transboundary movement of stuff, including hazardous materials. And there's a proposal that's about to be submitted to modify how e-waste is managed under the Basel Convention. And it would, if I understand the proposal correctly, it would have a very significant adverse impact on the ability of US generators of e-waste, the people who collect the e-waste from municipalities and others, to then move those to markets overseas. That's something we're going to keep an eye on. The proposal is going to be jointly issued by Switzerland and Ghana. What makes that important to be aware of is that Switzerland is part of the EU, and they probably are, if they're going to be the proponent for it, that means most of the EU is going to support it. And the fact that Ghana supports it and means that lesser developed countries are going to want to rally around that. And so although the e-waste side of recycling is not always the most visible part of the system, it's something where we might see some significant changes in the next 6 to 12 months, and we'll be following that closely.
Perfect. Thank you so much, David. And a reminder, do not put your e-waste in your recycling cart. Hey, Kate, do you want to close this up real quick? We'll have a couple slides past you, but maybe do a brief look in your crystal ball.
Sure. I mean, to echo what David said, anybody that says they know exactly what's going to happen, I don't think anybody knows. I do think that one of the things that we are anticipating is that there could be a second and third round of this in the fall and the winter in terms of what we are hearing from public health officials. And so we are preparing ourselves and our staff for, you know, a reopening in Minnesota, which will start to happen next week, but we could see a resurgence in the fall and in the winter. And so I don't think we're through this by any means. And so we're preparing for that. And I think that just means continuing to have flexibility and resiliency in how we operate. So for example, our staff that's working from home, which is customer service and administrative staff, we're not planning to bring back anytime soon.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, it's going to be something we're going to be managing for a good long while. Hey, Trish, do you have some slides you want to share with us to close this up?
Hey, Dylan, you bet. Thank you. Now, Because of this new normal, David, I like how you teed that up quickly. It is now our opportunity to, and we have the opportunity to start supporting some of these organizations who are taking their conferences virtual through the rest of the summer. David, what do we need to know about Swanapalooza?
Oh, thank you, Tricia. So some of you probably were planning on attending Swanapalooza in Atlanta in late March. We've converted that event into a virtual event that will take place in June, on June 22nd to the 25th. It's going to really be very similar to what you would have experienced in Atlanta. There are going to be a combination of high-level keynote speakers speaking about recycling, sustainability, and other waste-related topics. The commissioner from the New York City Department of Sanitation, Catherine Garcia, is going to be our opening keynote speaker. She's going to speak about how New York City has dealt with being the epicenter of COVID-19 from a waste perspective. I think that's really going to be interesting. There's going to be some live segments, some pre-recorded segments, and we're going to also offer an opportunity for digital networking among peers as well as with our exhibitors in a virtual trade show. So we're really excited to offer this. We're a little nervous about whether people are going to participate with us for 3 afternoons in a row in late June. The event's going to basically be from 1:30 or 2 o'clock to 4:30 or 5 o'clock each afternoon. I promise it'll be better than any Zoom call that you've been on so far. And the best news is that you don't have to buy an airline ticket or get a hotel reservation to attend the event. So I really hope that you'll go to swanapalooza.org and look at the conference and decide, you know what, that's going to be a good way to spend some time in June. And again, to the Recycling Partnership, thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this webinar today.
Oh, thank you, David. We are so happy to have had you today and cannot wait to be a part of Swanapalooza and see what you all put together. It is such an honor to support you as you're the first to really venture into the virtual waters in our industry and space here. And Colin, I loved how David really teed you up there. Are you still with us?
I am still with you.
Boom.
Thanks, David. We're going to be hosting 6 webinars beginning weekly on July 8th. These are going to be free to register. We are calling this series The New Normal. So I guess we're on the same wavelength as David. Appreciate that. Unfortunately, we had to postpone Resource Recycling Conference until next year because of the virus. It was scheduled for August, but it's just not doable this year. So we are still planning on delivering, the top level discussions that we host each year. And we're looking forward to moving it into a virtual environment. Kind of the same thing. We're hoping to move it kind of beyond your average Zoom call with a number of features. So I think it will be pretty interesting. We're going to be talking with haulers, processors, how they're adapting to COVID, how local programs are managing budgets, domestic markets, contracting issues, all sorts of topics. So I would encourage everyone to register and join us for those sessions and kind of get through this this conference list world that we're in while still, connecting with each other.
Awesome. Thanks, Colin. We're so excited to be a part of it and support you as well. For those of you with us looking for these links, you'll be able to find them on the Recycling Partnerships channels, as well as in this webinar deck, which will be available on our COVID-19 URL webpage later this week. We have a new social media kit for you since we spoke last to help you encourage your residents to recycle more and better during the pandemic, like we discussed today, and using this opportunity to educate. All the images are free to use and corresponding text is included. There are special posts about keeping masks and PPE out of the recycling bins like we discussed today, and the importance that you can download that on our site, as well as find us and all of your COVID-19 communication resources through these hyperlinks, which again will be available to you on the Recycling Partnerships website /COVID-19 later this week. Thank you so much to our panelists for this incredible discussion today. It's such an honor to work with you and to collaborate with you during this new normal and these challenging times. We so appreciate everyone's time and attention today. Again, as you have so many opportunities now and places to listen in, we appreciate you listening with us and look forward to talking to you again soon. I think our final note is this, Dylan. What do you think?
Yes, we are all in this bin together, and we're grateful for all of your support, and we hope this has been helpful, and we look forward to hearing from you. Feedback's a gift, and we certainly appreciate it. So thanks again to all our speakers, and thank you all for coming together to share this information. Great talking to everybody here at People's Voices.
Take care, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.